It's a great time, great transition going on in the Horn of Africa, and this conference could not have taken place in a more appropriate time. We're witnessing a tremendous change that has the potential to transform the Horn of Africa region. Whether you talk about the transition in Somalia with the embedded hope of ending a 20-year statelessness, the leadership transition, the passing of Mala Zenawi in Ethiopia brings us a great optimism for change, and the preliminary talks that just started between the Ogaden National Liberation Front and Ethiopia is a thing to watch. With that said, we have very interesting panelists today. We will start with the role of the diaspora in the transformation of the region, followed by a panel on Ethiopia's leadership, a continuation of the conversation we started yesterday, followed by Somalia and its future panel. I think you can join me in expressing our thanks to our speakers who have traveled, in fact, internationally for this conference. And we could not be happier to really be part of this conversation led by the preeminent voices in the Horn of Africa affairs. And you have the full program with their bios. I would like to ask you all to give a hand of applause for our speakers who came from a long distance. With that said, I'm going to turn over to my brother Idris, who is going to moderate our first panel on the role of the diaspora and the role of the diaspora, I should say it properly, in regional politics. So, welcome, Idris.
And my name is Idris. Today I will be moderating this first part of the event. And as Hamza said, the theme of actually the event, this first part of the event today, is the role of diaspora in regional politics. As you know, when this particular conference started yesterday, and for those of you who were here yesterday, and there were actually things that were touched in regard to diaspora politics, I mean in regards to regional politics. And that being said, again, I thank our panelists here today. And in our panelists here today, we will have Professor Abdul Razak Warfa, who's actually right there. And then the other person who will have is, and if I can just actually go ahead and give you a brief bio of Dr. Abdul Razak, of which you have all the bios of all the participants here. Dr. Abdul Razak is actually an assistant professor at Metropolitan University in St. Paul here at Minnesota. And then our second panelist today will be Dr. Terence Lyon. Nice meeting you, Dr. Lyons. And Dr. Terence is an associate professor at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution and co-director of Center for Global Studies at George Mason University. And that being said, you find that we are all diasporans, as we're sitting here, and most of us. And the role of diaspora as partners to actually regional development, I will touch a little information on the role of diaspora before I actually go out and call my panelists to come and dissect that issue and further. The role of diaspora in our homelands, as you know, in terms of social, economics, and political affairs, has gained currency in international development. International organizations have increasingly shown that diaspora plays an increasingly significant role in many spheres of their respective home countries. In the past few years, a role of diaspora group in development processes, i.e. peace, stability, and nation building and state formations has come to an attention of policymakers and researchers in the globe. This is a growing conventional wisdom that instead of seeing people living in diaspora, whether as migrants, as we all know that we have been seen as migrants, and when we are here, or refugees, as a marginalized and vulnerable group in need of help. The image of diaspora group agent of change in the developing world is actually imagined. You try to look at what is going on in the globe today, you find that all the offsprings that's actually being initiated around, it's something that's being initiated by the diasporans using social media. And the other thing that the diaspora actually contributes to the regions includes, for example, the flow of economic, we send remittance or money back home, social, transfer of human capital in the form of ideas and experience, skills, remittance to the Horn of Africa as far as higher than that of international donors. You'll find that if we go out and look at what is being remitted by the diasporans back at home, most of the time, if you compare that with what is being given by the international donors, you find that that actually surpasses what is actually given out there. And I'm not going to take that much time. What I will do now, I'll try to actually call my panelists to come to the table here. Then we'll start discuss.
Three things that I hope will help set the scene for what I hope we can have as a nice interactive discussion among you, many of you who are the diasporans, and somebody like me who tries to understand the roles of diaspora in politics. I'm going to lay out some ideas about a framework for thinking about diasporas and transnational politics more generally. I'm going to talk a little bit about Horn of Africa diasporas, maybe a bit more about the Ethiopian diaspora in Washington that I know better than the Somali diaspora or the Oromo diaspora here in Minneapolis, and then conclude with some ideas, some experiences about working with the diaspora in conflict resolution processes, particularly in dialogue processes. All right. The first thing I want to say is that all politics today is transnational. It's not at all unusual. It's not at all novel. It's not at all exotic anymore for political action to be rooted in communities of people, people who feel themselves to be engaged in a common project or working towards a common goal, that these communities work together but are no longer geographically restricted. And so that people in different parts of the world, whether it's Minneapolis or Toronto or Hargeisa and London or Washington and Addis Ababa, that the geographic restrictions where people need to be in the same place and face-to-face in order to engage in political debates, make political decisions, form party coalitions, and so forth. The space is now much less important. This is largely the a rather standard story of globalization. That as, in particular, transportation has become cheaper. It used to be very expensive to fly on jets, and compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago, travel is cheaper. Communications, in particular, cheaper. And so that what used to be a movement from somebody from, say Ireland to Boston was to disconnect social ties. Now you can go back and forth regularly. You can follow Irish football on your computer. You can call your mom every week if you want to. You may not even close your bank account back home because you know you'll be going back and forth so often and you don't want to pay the fees. And so it's a very different way. Human mobility has been transformed by globalization, and therefore politics has also been transformed. And you can no longer understand the politics in many places around the world by looking at what happens within that geographic space. It's true in Somalia, but it's also true in the Dominican Republic, and it's true in Croatia, and it's true in Sri Lanka, and it's true in Mexico, and it's a fairly common aspect of the world today. A variety of different political actors see in diasporas resources, social networks that are valuable to mobilize. States often do this. States see in the diasporas sources of money, of financial support, also communities that can help lobby on their behalf. The states therefore often offer things like dual citizenship or particular tax holidays for diasporans to keep them connected. They want the nation to include Silicon Valley and the money that's there, or traders elsewhere in the world, and so forth. So states do it. In the Ethiopian case, it's most apparent where opposition parties do it. The opposition in Ethiopia is largely rooted in the ideas, the resources, the debates that take place within the Ethiopian communities abroad. And then civil society can tap on diasporas for whether it's for development or to pursue human rights or democratization or women's rights, whatever it is that the civil society organization wants to advance. Transnational networks, people who are based in one place but are linked to someplace else, are extremely valuable, extremely effective instruments for politics. They are particularly important in a couple of settings, and they have a particular characteristic in a couple of circumstances as well. They are often particularly important in cases where there are either authoritarian regimes or the political community perceives its homeland as being occupied. So if politics can't take place at home, if people cannot speak back home, those abroad, the importance, the significance, the salience of those abroad will become much greater. And so there's a interaction where in places that are highly authoritarian, that politics gets displaced. It moves into the diaspora, where if there's a democratic opening or the ability to speak within the country, then the diaspora becomes less vital because there is more space back in the homeland. This is particularly, some of the strongest diasporas are diasporas that grew out of a perception of occupation, whether it's Palestinians or Tamils in Sri Lanka, the Irish, the Eritreans. There's a number of examples where it is the fact that the diaspora is the repository of the nation and the nation's future, because back home kinsmen are not able to operate that way. I also think that there's a particular type of diaspora that I've labeled conflict-generated diaspora. Diasporas that go abroad as a consequence of violence and war. And I think they're different than diasporas, other types of diasporas, whether they're economic diasporas or diasporas, the Indian diaspora, where people have left India and come to the United States for schools, for jobs, all kinds of reasons, important in different ways. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. One is that one reflects back on this idea of authoritarian, the occupation. They fled, and therefore there's some sort of unfinished business back home. They have the ability to act in ways that their friends and relatives who remain back home cannot. And so that takes on a very particular, makes it particularly significant for that movement. It's also the case that there's often diasporas or human migration is separated by age. Young men, for example, leaving while others stay at home, and so the diaspora is predominantly young men or young women in the case of a lot of the domestics and nannies back, in the United States and so forth. Conflict-generated diasporas are often entire villages or extended families. It's more that you didn't just leave and you're connected with your brothers and your sisters you left behind, but they came with you, or they were killed as a result of not making it across the border successfully. And so that's, again, a very different link to the homeland than, say, the Indians or the Norwegians or somebody else has with their homeland. All diasporas are, they're not frozen in time, and so you should be suspicious of somebody like me that talks about the diaspora, because there's a series of diasporas. There's diasporas that vary according to when they came to the United States. It's very important. For example, in the Ethiopian diaspora, there was a generation that came in the 1970s that had a particular political characteristics that is different than the diaspora people who came more recently. There's also generational changes. The children of diaspora, people who've lived more than one or two generations. It varies, and sometimes the second and third generation there's less of a connection, but in other cases it remains very, very vital. The Armenian diaspora, for example, remains highly, highly mobilized, even though many of the leaders are third, fourth, fifth generation, in the United States. But there's something about that identity that remains very vital. And it varies by location. I see this in very interesting ways being here in Minnesota, and how Minneapolis is not Washington, and how different concentrations of different people. Columbus is not Minnesota either, Columbus, Ohio, that these things, the different groups, the dynamics of different groups, the political engagement of different groups varies by size. Washington, and the Ethiopians in Washington is very different than the Ethiopians in Minnesota in terms of the ethnic makeup and engagement in politics and a whole range of other things. Let me maybe with those 2 points out of the way, say just a couple of words about some diaspora dialogue projects that I've been involved in. It's clear that diasporas are connected back to their homelands, not just homelands in conflict, but in particular ways to homelands that are in conflict. They often play a role of polarizing the conflict, making it more difficult for people in the middle, or political movements in the middle, to gain traction or legitimacy, because diaspora, in some cases, this is a generalization, but they're often more categorical in their political positions towards the homeland. In other words, it's not shades of gray, and we have to, agree on this but disagree with this. There's all parties are mixed in terms of their, whether they're, there's not just bad guys and good guys, but a lot of very complicated politics in between. Diasporas often have a much more simple story, a black and white story, and therefore relate to conflict in what I will call categorical ways. And so therefore, working with diasporas, the projects that I've been involved in Washington, and particularly with Ethiopians, have been designed to try to bring diaspora representatives together in order to have a long and extended dialogue so that those stories could become more complicated, so that voices within the diaspora that were often silenced by the spokespeople who were very committed to one position or another could begin to emerge. At George Mason University, at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, where I have my faculty position, we worked for 3 years with a group from the Ethiopian diaspora to try to develop this. We met once a month, really 9 months a year, because in the summer faculty disappear. One Saturday a month to bring this conversation, to continually work at first on the group building confidence and a sense of trust among themselves, so that the 10th, 11th, and 12th meetings were very different than the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd meetings, and the 20th, 24th, 25th meetings were different yet again, as a way to try to build up political views in the diaspora, try to encourage diaspora representatives who had these views to be more confident, to be able to speak more clearly, and in that way to open up political space back in Ethiopia for more options for those actors in Ethiopia who are trying to build peace. A second way that there's that diasporas often try to engage in conflict resolution is by creating organizations that can then lobby, can then do the public relations, can then do the media work, can help move the United States, not only the US government, but also other powerful institutions in the United States, like the World Bank and the UN, or the Carter Center for that matter, or the Gates Foundation for that matter, to take on their agenda. And there's been a lot of work on that as well, of engaging with diasporas, again, to try to make them a force for peace. Why don't I conclude my remarks there, because I look forward to hearing from you, and for me to be lecturing you on diasporas is a bit ironic, or a bit, I'm usually talking to other Americans, and I'm trying to explain to them that the diaspora representatives, or the groups that they live in, they're not that exotic. They're not that strange. They're just people they're just political communities who want to pursue certain political, agendas, and don't freak out just because they come in this particular package. But I don't need to tell you that since you're living it. So I look forward to your responses. And
now you should be able to hear me. All right, thank you. Thank you. That was a nice introduction to the role of diaspora in regional politics. So I come here not as a political scientist, that's not my background, but as a member of the diaspora who happens to be in academia. So what I would like to touch on are 2 points. What role does Somali diaspora play in Somali politics? Okay. And so my focus is really on Somalia and Somalis. And secondly, what role should we play? So what role do Somali diaspora currently play, and what role should we play in Somali politics? I think there's a general agreement that the role of diaspora can be a moderating one. They can have a moderating influence on conflict and post-conflict in countries of origin. But as Dr. Lyons pointed out, in the case of Somalia, maybe that's a classical example of a conflict-generated textbook example, in that we may have been playing in Somali politics as enablers of what's going on in Somalia. That's to say that this notion of members of diaspora playing a role that's less inclined to compromise and more to clan politics and enabling, because we have the social capital and the financial means to support that. But there are some writers who argue that diaspora members can have a positive influence in regional politics. Margaret Birdie of University of British Columbia comes to mind, where she argues that because we are geographically distant from where the conflict is, there's less emotional investment, and we are less prone to anger as a result of that. Okay? But at best we could say Somali diaspora really had a little influence in Somali politics as of now, in terms of peace-building efforts, in terms of conflict resolution. Okay? We are mainly, Somali diaspora members are mainly what I would describe as helicopter politicians. They fly in to run for opposition, they fly out if they lose, or or whatever duration they are in there, they will be in there and then they will come back. For March, maybe a good example of this, right after he lost the prime ministership, he flew back to upstate New York. Now he went back to run for office. And my guess is he will be back if he doesn't get the prime ministership. So it will probably be Ahmed Samatar. He will be back to McAllister since he didn't get the position. Okay, so we are helicopter politicians, most likely. Now, if we are conflict-generated diaspora, right, and we worsen the conditions in the ground, mainly safeguarding clan interests most of the time, what could we do differently? If you look at the recent presidential running in early September, diaspora was well represented, right? There were a lot of members from diaspora. So it kind of shows you that what we're really interested in is the highest position. And if you don't get that, then we're back to our academia or whatever we come from, a cubicle. So if you're looking at this Somali politics, it went through a couple of phases. We had the warlords. Following the warlords, we have the religious lords. And then during the Sharif presidency, we have the money lords. Looking at this latest run for president, it seems we have a PhD lords, right? A lot of those who were running were touting their PhD by degree. So, but we know that we can't all be presidents, right? We can't all be presidents. So what role should we play as members of diaspora? And I would argue there are two roles diaspora really can play other than running for presidency or prime ministership. One is that building infrastructure, right? And the other is developmental efforts. So I'm an educator, so I'm going to focus on a little bit on the developmental effort aspects. Now, modern-day Somalia is a dichotomy in international development. On the one hand, we enabled what's going on, but also economically we support conflict-prone region in which the money we're sending back home is really the only economy that's holding the state. We may be stateless, right? What Professor McCann's probably called mediated state, right? Where there's no state, but there is a state. So members of diaspora seem to help that state. But it's also well known that diaspora efforts, particularly in efforts of education, right, in conflict and post-conflict countries, it has been demonstrated that they can lead to success in improving society and also democratization efforts. So for example, there was a study done in 2008 in which it was shown that 10% of children in school, the risk of those 10% of children would go down by 4% if there was an effort in education. So that's to say that if the children that were at risk were 55%, right, that can go down to, but by 14%, 10% down. So it could go down to 45% or so. Similarly, there were other studies done by Huff and Burrells in 2009 in which showed that democratic attitudes change as a result of education. And we all Somalis have this fundamental belief that ako online waftin laan. Yet we don't seem, those of us in diaspora, we don't seem to support that idea. Okay, so what sort of efforts can members of the diaspora do in order to help both the regional politics and development efforts back home? Well, let me give you a quick example of a project that I'm involved here at the University of Minnesota. It's a project that we're calling Somali Diaspora and Education Advocacy Project. And the idea is that members of the Somali diaspora can help educational efforts back home. And the goal is that the first thing in education starts with teachers, right? So without having teachers, the chance of having good education is low. So the idea is that members of the diaspora can help educate the teachers, so prepare pre-service teachers and so forth. And one way we could do is we have a social capital here in the US, right? So we could talk to our colleagues at the academia and say, can we train teachers? Maybe we'll give a diploma, a certificate. And so those teachers will get that certificate, but they also get the education. And Somali diaspora members who earn education in the US can help that process. So that's one way members of diaspora can play a role. One other thing I would like to point out is that, again, looking at the number of PhD holders running for presidency back home, a lot of those were the old guard as well. So those are those who left Somalia before the Somali conflict happened. A number of the new generation, the Generation X or whatever you want to call them, are not really part of that group. So it seems they're the silent majority because there are a lot who receive higher education here in the US, but they don't seem to be playing any role. So I think I'm going to stop there, and those are some of my thoughts.
That applause was a little bit more powerful than the previous one. So I'm not going to repeat there. And thank you very much.
I'm really delighted by the diversity of the issues and the topics you are discussing here. Earlier, I was introduced to the mission and the values which IHASA promotes, and I was delighted enough with that. But when I saw the program today, I'm even more delighted because the issues which are being discussed here since yesterday are contemporary issues which are contemporary issues which are of importance to the Horn of Africa. Oh, sorry. the issues being discussed are of great importance to the Horn of Africa. I appreciate, as I said earlier, the mission to promote peace, justice, equality and development as mentioned in the mission of IHASA. And these discussions are taking place in the background of great developments in the Horn of Africa. I think to start with, in the last 2 years, Sudan was split into two. We have two Sudans now, after 2 decades of war. That is a great development and a very positive one at that. Kenya has promulgated a new, very far-reaching democratic constitution, and we are going into the first election in the next few months. Ethiopia has undergone a transition from the rule of a long, I think, ruling prime minister, and has proved wrong many who thought that Ethiopian power structure was regime-based and was not constitutional or democratic enough to withstand such transition. I think we are happy that we have crossed that bridge, and they have respected their constitution and their institutions. Somalia has just had its first election, or at least at parliamentary level, and we have a president elected by the people, and we have done away with the transition arrangement which was there for the last few years. In the last week, I think, or the last few days, Kismayo was freed also of militant groups, which is also a very positive development. So when we combine all this and then we see you people are discussing issues relating to that part of the world, I think it can only be very positive and very encouraging that you are comparing notes when there's real action on the ground. The other development which was mentioned earlier here is after almost 100 years of differences and conflict, I think there is light at the end of the tunnel in Ethiopia, where there is now discussions, face-to-face discussions between two parties who have been warring for a long time, and we are very hopeful that it will lead maybe to peaceful settlement of a conflict which has been with us for a very long time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm quite encouraged and, that you are discussing these issues. I'm happy to be part of it. And as I came from Kenya to here, one, in pursuit of the decisions which we made in the Constitution, Kenya has gone from a very centralized governance system where power was concentrated in the hands of the presidency, and we have now devolved and scattered the powers from the center. And that has, one of the institutions produced out of that was we are going to have counties for the first time. I'm running for governor in the county of Garissa. And as I came over here, in fact, I came to see the diaspora. I want to emphasize the importance of the diaspora even in our own internal decision making, because both as people who came from very close proximity to that county, people who have transited through Garissa, people who have left relatives behind in Garissa, you are part and parcel of the decision making in Garissa. And in my own calculations, I realized that the diaspora here can affect the election outcome in that place, and I came to plead with them so that they can call their relatives back home so they can vote for me. Some of them have dual citizenship. So I came to plead with them to travel back home to vote for me. So you can imagine the strength of the diaspora both in our internal politics. The dynamics or the demographics of the election of the Garissa County is very interesting, because the local population is 700,000, and I have 700,000 refugees in camps in the county. A few of them are very dynamic, very clever. They have got Kenyan papers. And I know some of the relatives are here. I want them to talk to them. In fact, the next few weeks I'll be going to refugee camps to plead for them to vote for me. So Kenya is a very interesting thing. So as you mentioned earlier, the diaspora is a very influential group, both as remitters of very needed funds for the communities who have remained behind. And now even there's a reverse immigration, because a decade or 2 decades ago, people have come through very difficult routes. Each person who came over has a story to tell on how he made it to the West, either Western Europe or to the North America. But now there's reverse migration, because in the last 3 years alone, I think almost 1,000 families have moved back to Nairobi, or people who have gained papers in the West or in Western Europe or North America, and who are migrating back for cultural, religious, or economic issues. And that migration itself, I think, is going to produce people who will influence both the economies and the other factors, the social factors in those countries, both in Somalia and in Kenya and in neighboring countries. So do not underestimate the powers you have in those areas, even in conflict resolution, which I think is being covered here, and in the pursuit of peace. In the last 2 years, I was engaged in following up Kenya's commitment to bring peace in Ethiopia between the ONLF and the Ethiopian government. Every person I have talked to and related on this matter, at least on the side of the ONLF, was somebody in the West, either in Canberra in Australia, or in Helsinki, or Copenhagen, Geneva, London, Pretoria. I have not talked to anybody who was in the trenches or in Gudai or anywhere else. That shows that if there will be peace, which we hope there will be, and which we are pursuing very vigorously and very delicately, then that peace can only be come from the people in diaspora. I'm happy that these people, despite the difficult circumstances under which they came, have gained very crucial education, developed their sophistication to understand and resolve those conflicts. Some time back, somebody told me that you do not expect to achieve peace with people in the West, because where they have reached and the standards of rights and the privileges they are used to, they are not in reality with what they can get in the African continent. Therefore, their demands are likely to be higher than what they can ever get. I said we will have to prove that, because as we pursue peace, we need to appreciate the environment under which things are happening. So ladies and gentlemen, I know I was given only 2 minutes. Thank you for listening to me. I will have a function tomorrow which is dedicated only to me. And I will talk for hours, and I'll answer as many questions as possible. So I would like to encourage everybody who will have time, please come to that function. I'll give the background of the Kenyan system and the many other things which we are doing in the Horn of Africa. So I would like to invite you there. Thank you very much, Madam.